Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Bogue Banks. A lot of people know Bogue Banks better as Emerald Isle. I'll get into those two different names here in just a little bit, but there is two things I wanted to address before I got into the episode, and I promise I'm not going to talk very long. One is the tardiness of this episode. This episode was supposed to go out last Saturday. It is currently, this Saturday. It's October 5th, and I'm a week late on it. But I had some technical difficulties, and then my microphone messed up, and a lot of personal stuff was going on, and I had the episode ready. It just didn't happen. The second thing I want to address is the flooding in western North Carolina. I'm sure most of you are aware now. If you're new to the show, what you may not be aware of is my last episode before this one was the 1916 Western North Carolina flood. I'm not kidding about that. And I titled that show "The Flood to End All Floods" because that was what they called it back then, the flood to end all floods. There was no way, I had no way of knowing that a week after I covered the 1916 Western North Carolina flood that Western North Carolina would get a flood that would beat the flood to end all floods. And I'm not making a joke about that, but if I had to do that again, I would hold off. If you don't know when I recorded that episode, it might come off as insensitive. I'm not trying to capitalize on somebody's loss and somebody's suffering. It was an absolute, complete coincidence, a 1 in a billion chance that I would decide to cover that episode. And I wasn't even thinking about it being hurricane season. As a matter of fact, while I was covering that episode, we were on the tail end of the tropical storm that flooded eastern North Carolina. And anyway, if you go and listen to the episode, if that's triggering for some, I do apologize. That wasn't my intention. And I may even take it down for a little while. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. So let's get into the episode. Again, we're going to be talking about Bogue Banks. Some people call it Emerald Isle. It's an island off the coast of Carteret County, down east North Carolina. It's where I grew up going to the beach at, and I grew up calling the whole island Emerald Isle. I was trying to find for sure. I think the island is called Bogue Banks, but again, me and a lot of people I knew grew up calling it Emerald Isle. But Emerald Isle is one of the beaches that I'm going to talk about that's on the island. So for this episode, if I'm talking about Bogue Banks, I'm going to be talking about the whole island. If I'm talking about Emerald Isle Beach, then I'm talking about the beach. But anyway, the island itself is a 21-mile island. Man, it's windy out here. If you're watching on YouTube, my paper is blowing all over the place. The Bogue Banks is a 21-mile long island that's separated from the rest of Carteret County by Bogue Sound. Now, if you're thinking about the North Carolina coast in general, you think, well, the coast heads north and south. Bogue Banks actually is positioned on the part of North Carolina that kind of curves out into the Atlantic. So the island itself, Bogue Banks, is actually pointed more east and west than it is north and south. Now, like I hinted at earlier, the island itself, and I'm going to get into the history of it in a minute, but the island itself is broken up into 6 beaches. Emerald Isle Beach, Indian Beach, Knoll Shores, Salter Path, Atlantic Beach, and Fort Macon on the far east end. Emerald Isle is on the west end. Fort Macon is on the east end. And as far as the name, Bogue, that's B-O-G-U-E. It's an odd name. I guess I didn't realize until I started recording this show that it's actually kind of hard to say if you're trying to say it quickly. Bogue Shores. Or Bogue Banks. That makes it even harder. But as far as that strange name, it seems that they're not real sure exactly where it came from. There's 2 possibilities I found in our research. The word bogue is an old Norman French word that means narrow channel or passage of water. And I will say, on the west end of the island, you have the White Oak River. On the east end, you have Harlow Creek. And all along the island, or from the mainland, you have a bunch of other smaller creeks and streams that dump into the Bogue Sound. So the name may have came from Norman French, or the Norman French language. The other possibility, there's a guy named William Bogue, also B-O-G-U-E, and he settled in the Perquimans Yeah, it's Perquimans. I'm never sure if I say that right because there's Perquimans County. Anyway, he settled in the Perquimans precinct in the Albemarle area in the Carolina colony before we were a state. And that was 1689. So the name may have came from William Bogue. But despite the name origin, John Lawson, who I've talked about on the show before, he was a surveyor from the Bath and New Bern area, and he's a big name. He kind of traveled all around North Carolina surveying and meeting Native Americans and studying the culture. But he made a map in 1709, and in his map it's called Bogue Inlet. And the research says that if John Lawson called it the Bogue Inlet, most likely the Native Americans were calling it the Bogue Inlet or some variation of that name. So they're not real sure, I guess, who first started calling it Bogue, but that is a strange name, and that's the name it carries on with today. Now, as far as the rest of the history goes, and people on the island, the island population, it most likely would have started as a bunch of smaller Native American fishing villages. And like everywhere else in our history, where there's Native Americans, the white people, the white man will find their way there. And that's what happened here. So the Native American villages, the Native American fishing villages, ended up becoming colonial fishing villages. Now you fast forward 100 or so years, and you got Lieutenant Eliason. I did not put his last name in my notes, unless that was his last name. You got Lieutenant Eliason, and he started surveying the east end of Bogue Banks for the construction of a fort that would ultimately be called Fort Macon. And it was named after a North Carolina statesman named Nathaniel Macon. And I'm not going to talk about Fort Macon too much in this episode because I covered it in episode 29 of the show. Now, that was the most notable fort, I guess, on Bogue Banks, but there were other smaller forts built before then that were destroyed by hurricanes and erosion and various other issues. Now, ultimately, Fort Macon would be surrendered to the Union forces during the Civil War in 1862. After that, it was used as a military prison, I guess, for the rest of the Civil War. And then in 1924, Fort Macon would become the second state park in North Carolina's history. Now, I know we're already at 1924. We're going back up a minute. I'm just talking about Fort Macon for right now. Though it became a state park in 1924, the state park officially opened in 1936. And it says it's the most visited state park on the coastal plain. And I've been to Fort Macon years ago, but many, many times. It's a really, really cool fort. I think it's a common design or became a common design, but they dug in the ground to build it. So if you're out in the surf or in the ocean and you look toward the land, you can't even really tell there's a fort there. The roof of the fort has grass on it and dirt, and it's kind of matches up with the surrounding earth. So it looks just like a hillside, and it's hard to tell there's actually a fort down kind of in a hole there. But anyway, let's get back to the history of Bogue Banks. When I talked about these fishing villages, the fishing was your typical fish, but eventually they developed into whaling. The whaling industry took over, so they ended up as these whaling communities. I don't know anything about whaling, but I guess after they caught their whales and they came to shore, this is where they would finish the processing part in these whaling villages. But eventually, as you know, the whaling industry would go down. Whaling would become illegal. Most of the whaling villages were on the east end of the island in that Fort Macon area. But once the whaling industry went away, there was no real good reason to be on that end of the island. So a lot of settlers started moving down the island to the west. And this brings us to Salter Path. They believe Salter Path was named after Owen Salter or Riley Salter. I really couldn't find anything on either one of these two guys, but I'm assuming they were residents there or somebody of prominence. But again, they started a fishing village was established there. And if you've ever been to Emerald Isle or really anywhere in the Outer Banks, the islands are very narrow. It's not a very long way between sound and ocean. Well, these guys in this fishing village, they would kind of walk back and forth between the sound and the ocean while they were fishing, and they wore down a path, and they think that's why it's called Salter Path, is because of this literal path that was worn down across the width of the island there. Now, with all this great fishing in this Salter Path area, a ton of people would kind of move to this area for the fish, and I guess at that time, relying on the fish to survive, they'd move to this area, and this was around 1800s. The thing was, a lot of these guys set up huts, homes, cabins, cottages, but they had no actual claim to the land. They were essentially squatting on the property. Eventually, a guy named John A. Royal from Boston, Massachusetts, I think I said it right that time, Massachusetts. Anyway, he would buy the land, and when he purchased the land, unfortunately, the squatters kind of came with it. It was kind of a package deal. Then in 1915, this land, Salter Path, would pass on to a lady named Alice Green Hoffman. And she was from New York, and she was a descendant of Theodore Roosevelt. And I'll try to remember to mention something about that later, but I couldn't find out exactly how she was linked to Teddy Roosevelt, but she was one of his kinfolk. So she buys Salter Path, but included in her purchase is Salter Path, what they know today as Indian Beach, Pine Knoll Shore, and part of Atlantic Beach. And this lady, she wasn't just some rich lady who bought a bunch of land. She was kind of an entrepreneur and a self-starter. So in the 1940s, she writes to the state of North Carolina, and she wants to have the land surveyed around Bogue Banks to create a Bogue Banks State Park. Now, unfortunately, the funding for this Bogue Banks State Park never came. And then the idea kind of died out. However, in 1971, the Roosevelts donated to North Carolina 290 acres for a natural area, and this includes the land where the North Carolina Aquarium now sits. But anyway, Alice Hoffman, she eventually builds an estate on present-day Pine Knoll Shore. And the problem, though, was that, again, you had all these squatters on her property. So she eventually sues the residents or the squatters of Salter Path in 1923. And I think ultimately her goal was to get these squatters out of here, but the lawsuit was, the complaint was that these squatters' cows were coming onto her property, I guess, eating her grass, eating her plants. So that was the nature of the lawsuit, but I do think ultimately it was trying to clear all these squatters out of here. And it did go to court. Now, the court, ultimately, they didn't kick the squatters out. The court permitted the squatters, and I hate to keep calling them that, but they permitted the squatters to stay in Salter Path, but the cows were not allowed to graze on the Hoffman estate. Now, without fencing, I'm not sure how you enforce that unless putting up fence was part of it. Also, the squatters' village was restricted to 81 acres. So they had these 81 acres. And man, I tell you, like I said, I've been down there and it's narrow. I'm not sure what 81 acres on Emerald Isle looks like or Bogue Banks looks like, but they more or less gave or restricted the squatters to these 81 acres. As far as the beachfront goes, they made that kind of a community use. They didn't give that to Hoffman or the squatters. That was for everybody. And also, all these rules that the court put in, this was for the squatters and their descendants. If for whatever reason they moved, they forfeited the land. Nobody else could come in and I guess, partake in these benefits. And this stayed in place until 1979. And then, I guess, a different court, they more or less gave the property to the squatters at this time. They gave them titles to their land and started taxing them for it. So at this point, they owned the land they were staying on, or their descendants, they fully owned the property. Ultimately, Alice Hoffman would own 2 miles of present-day Atlantic Beach, all of Pine Knoll Shore, all of Salter Path, and all of Indian Beach. Now let's talk about a guy named Henry Fort. He's from Philadelphia. I couldn't find when he actually came down to the area, but he also purchased a bunch of land that would one day become Emerald Isle. So ultimately, he owned all of what is Emerald Isle today. And he had some ideas of his own. The land he bought, all of Emerald Isle, he wanted to turn it into this big luxury resort. And he was kind of going to model it after Atlantic City. So this big, I'm assuming, gambling place, all these nice amenities. He wanted all of Emerald Isle to be this huge resort. The problem was, in order to, I guess, get this resort going, he needed a bridge from the mainland over to Emerald Isle. At this time, I think there was a really small bridge up on the west end, but Emerald Isle's on the east end. And the island is 21 miles long. So he needed to get this big bridge built. And right out of the gate, North Carolina told him that we're not going to give you the money to build this bridge. And then right after that, the Great Depression hit. And so the bridge wasn't built at that time, and his casino or his luxury resort was never built. Now, fast forward 20 or so years, 1953, Alice Hoffman passes away. And I'm not sure what happened to Henry Fort. It didn't say. But when Alice Hoffman passed away, the descendants of Alice Hoffman and Henry Fort started selling off their properties. So 7 people would buy a 12-mile stretch that is Emerald Isle or Emerald Isle Beach for $350,000. They sliced Emerald Isle into 54 blocks, 1,000 feet, 54 1,000 feet blocks going from the ocean to the sound. They put the blocks numbered into a hat and started drawing numbers out of the hat. Collectively, all these owners, these 12 owners, they wanted Emerald Isle to be this family-friendly vacation place. They all collectively agreed that's kind of what they wanted for the land. So since they all agreed, they limited commercial development and mobile homes to 5 blocks per owner. In 1957, Emerald Isle Beach was incorporated into a town, and then in 1960, a ferry service started that would take people from the mainland over to Emerald Isle. Then finally, in 1971, the Cameron-Langston Bridge was opened, and this is the big bridge. Now, there's 2 big bridges on each end of the island now, but this is the one on the east side. In 1971, that big bridge, the Cameron-Langston Bridge, was opened. And I can't remember if I said that was east or west, but the Langston Bridge is on the west. Emerald Isle's on the west. That's where the bridge opened up. I think I got myself confused. Anyway, again, if you've ever been to Emerald Isle, and these bridges, there's several of them up and down the East Coast. This bridge is a big arch. And I remember when I was a kid, and probably most kids, this bridge used to scare the hell out of me. I don't have a fear of car crashes. I don't have a fear of drowning. But I have a huge fear of crashing into water and drowning, specifically those criteria. Anyway, I don't know where that fear started, but I don't have it as bad today. But when I go over these big bridges over water, when I was a kid, it used to really scare me. Now let's talk about Atlantic Beach for a minute, and I'm not going to keep backing up. I'm almost done with this episode. But Atlantic Beach is the oldest commercial town on Bogue Banks, and I didn't see when it became a town. But in the 1870s, a guy named Appleton Oaksmith had the idea to make Atlantic Beach a seaside resort. So essentially everybody who owned land out here had some big grand idea for it. Unfortunately, and very sadly for this guy, Oaksmith, he had 4 daughters, and they would all die in a car accident on July 4th, 1879. And after this, he just kind of lost everything. He didn't want to build his resort. I'm sure he was in terrible mourning. But this car crash alone stopped this resort from coming to Atlantic Beach. However, in 1887, 2 guys, that John J. Royal, who I mentioned, and another guy, Winfield Chadwick, they built this big bathing pavilion on Bogue Banks. I'm not sure what a bathing pavilion is. I'm not sure they mean like some sort of big shower house, or they actually mean like sunbathing. But they built this big pavilion out there. And it says it's located where the club colony is today. I couldn't find a whole lot on this pavilion, but it did say that this area became like a huge central area for entertainment with bands and dancing and parties. Then you fast forward many years. In 1928, Atlantic Beach, they kind of revitalized themselves and redefined themselves. They built a new resort in an area called the Circle. And that Circle, and I don't ever remember visiting the Circle per se, but I remember this area in Atlantic Beach that was a real popular hot spot. It was right on the coast. I've always wondered if that was, this Circle area they're talking about, because it says that the Circle continues today to be the central area for parties and stuff like that. And if you've been down there, I don't know, it's been years since I've been to Atlantic Beach, but if you've been down there, the area I'm talking about used to have a human slingshot in it, and there was, I think, a few other rides there. There's a bit of a boardwalk there. I don't know if that's the circle or not, but that's what I'm picturing. And really, I mean, that revitalization, that rejuvenation period for Atlantic Beach, that was in 1928. To my knowledge, Bogue Banks really hasn't changed a whole lot since then. I'm sure it's been updated and upgraded, but a lot of my research, it sounds like Emerald Isle hasn't changed in the past almost 100 years. And that's the end of my notes, by the way. But I can tell you, that was the beach we went to when I was a kid. I started going to Myrtle Beach, I think, when I was early 20s. Was the first time I had ever been to Myrtle Beach, and that's where I've been ever since. And it's nothing toward North Carolina beaches. I tell everybody I don't go to Myrtle Beach because I like to party. I stay in a quiet area in Myrtle Beach. It's family friendly where I stay. But growing up, we went to Atlantic Beach every year. I think we took some day trips, so we went multiple times a year sometimes. And we stayed at a place, and it's still open. It's called Bogue Shores. It's a little hotel on the sound side there in Atlantic Beach. And I'm sure it's under different management now than it was when I was a kid, I guess, 30 years ago. But the hotel's still there. That's where we stayed. And we'd go up to, like I said earlier, we'd go up to Fort Macon all the time. We'd ride down to Emerald Isle. There was a restaurant down there. I wish Jamie, my wife, was out here. She could tell you exactly what it was. But there's a big restaurant down at Emerald Isle we used to eat at. And I made a lot of fond memories growing up on Atlantic Beach, or on Emerald Isle, Bogue Banks, whatever you want to call it. But again, I hadn't been a long time. I had taken my kids out when my oldest was youngest down to the Fort Macon State Park, and that was years ago. But that was the last time I was there. But otherwise, last time I was there, it looks like the island hasn't changed much since I was a kid. And I think part of the reason, honestly, to be honest with you, I think part of the reason I avoid it is some of you may know my parents passed away a couple years ago, and that was hard in itself. And I guess it wouldn't do me any favors to go back to where my mom and dad used to take us, when we were kids. But also, Bogue Shores, the reason we stayed at Bogue Shores is because my mom and dad said that's where they stayed when they were dating. And when me and my wife got old enough to drive ourselves to the beach, we started staying there. So I made a lot of fond memories down there, but it is kind of, bittersweet, I guess. And I'm not trying to make this into a sad cry for my parents episode, but that might have something to do with me not wanting to go back, in so many years. But anyway, that's all I have on Bogue Banks / Emerald Isle / Atlantic Beach, Indian Beach, Pine Knoll Shores. If you ever get a chance to go down there, it is a really cool place. If you've never been, definitely go down there. One thing we did every time we went down is we would go back on the mainland through Morehead City and go down to Beaufort, which I'm not going to talk too much about here, but I'll probably cover Beaufort eventually on the show. Beaufort is a really cool boating town, but very, very cool place, kind of historic. It feels like you kind of stepped back into history when you go there. But anyway, that's all I got. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If this was your first time listening, if you didn't like the show, I'd say check out a few more. Maybe you'll find one you do like. If this is your 130th time listening or whatever, I'm sorry that it was a late episode, but I'm glad I got it out. I'm glad I finally got my mess together and got it out. And if you're listening on a podcast player and you're wondering about this YouTube thing, check the links below. I have a link for the YouTube channel there. And if you're tired of seeing me and you'd rather just listen, that can be found on most podcast players. And if you're interested in a little bit more NC Everything content, I do a show with my wife called Tasting NC, where we taste everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Ironically, our last Tasting NC was involved a bunch of stuff we bought at Black Mountain, or in Black Mountain. And so I've uploaded that episode, but it's private right now. Again, with the disaster that is Western North Carolina, I feel like it may be in bad taste to upload that episode, so I'm going to hold on to that one for a little while. But there's plenty of other tasting NCs if you're interested. Anyway, that's all I got. I don't want to ramble on. Plus, it's getting kind of hot out here. Hope you enjoyed the show, and if everything goes well, I'll talk to you in a couple weeks, or a little bit less since I'm late now. I'll talk to you in a week. See you guys later.